Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar featuring our guest presenter, Mel Blackmore from Blackmores. Please note that all attendees are going to be muted during the duration of today's webinar. If you have any questions for the presenter or for PJR, we encourage you to use the designated question tab within your GoToWebinar control panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mel. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you. Fantastic to be here. And yeah, absolutely delighted to be presenting this webinar today on what you need to do to transition to the new ISO standard for information security, ISO 27001:2022. So yes, my name is Mel Blackmore, and I'm going to be taking you through step by step exactly what you need to do to transition to ISO 27001. I'm also going to be providing a high-level overview of the changes, just in case you didn't attend the last webinar, because I went through the changes to the standard in a lot more detail. So I definitely recommend going back and listening to that if you haven't done so already, but I will be recapping on a bit of that information today, just to provide a bit of context for what the changes are. Before we start diving into the changes, just to give you a little bit of an overview on who we are at Blackmores. We're a consultancy firm that specialises in implementing ISO standards for businesses across the globe, and we've got a 100% success rate. In terms of our credentials, we're the founders of IsologyHub, which is the 7-step approach to implementing any ISO standard, and also the founders of IsologyHub, which is an online platform for all things ISO when it comes to learning and development. So taking you from learner through to leader. We also have a very popular podcast as well, the ISO Show, which features interviews and thought leaders on ISO standards. So yeah, that's something that is generally published weekly if you want to get the latest updates on ISO standards. I'm very proud to say that we've got a fantastic client satisfaction rating in 2023. We had a Net Promoter Score of 97%, which I believe is the highest in our profession. So yeah, just very briefly, I'd just like to mention about the IsologyHub, and that's because we've created, with the help of our specialists in ISO 27001, an ISO 27001 transition game plan. So this helps you to go from, from the complete beginner, from the 2013 version, right through to having, training courses, templates, guidelines, and information to help you to manage the transition step by step. So that includes training videos on all the key changes, and also various resources that you need, for example, the new statement of applicability template. This is an example of some of the clients that we've worked with. So as with all ISO standards, ISO standards are based at a global level for organisations, from very small businesses through to large multinationals across any industry. And this is an example of the types of clients that we've worked with. So let's get on to why you're here today, which is learning about how to plan your ISO 27001 transition. So the first thing that you need to do is to contact your certification body directly to discuss when you might be able to conduct the transition visit. In most cases, you'll have two options, either to have a separate, dedicated transition visit, or to combine the transition visit with your annual surveillance visit. So what's the difference there? Well, the additional separate transition visit will come at an additional cost. So ideally, you want to try and avoid that if you can do. We'd advise you to combine the transition in an ideal world with your next annual audit if possible, as this would definitely save you on the overall costs. So the additional days required by the certification body will vary. It does depend on the size of your organisation, but most are citing either between half a day or a full day to verify the transition. So I'd recommend getting in contact with PJR as soon as possible in order to be able to book that in. So the change did come into effect in October in 2022, and organisations have until October 2025 to actually transition. So we're about halfway, and many organisations have already undertaken their transition visits. This webinar is for those of you that haven't undertaken that transition visit yet, and you're wondering what you need to do. You may not have started yet. And it's also for those of you that have made a start on transition, but they may not be 100% sure on, whether they've covered everything that they should have done in preparation for their transition visit. And that's something I'll be taking you through step by step. So what we want to avoid, obviously, is missing that deadline. Okay, so this is why I definitely recommend getting in contact with PJR as soon as possible, because based on experience, when these transitions come round, quite often there is a large last-minute rush, which severely limits the certification body's resources. And it has been known that some companies have lost their certification because they have simply left it too late. So please don't be one of those organisations. I think there's still plenty of time, so don't panic. There isn't any great rush, but you definitely do need to be booking in your next transition visit, ideally as part of your surveillance. If you do miss the deadline, then you will be required to go through another stage 1 and stage 2 assessment, like you did at the very beginning when you first implemented and got certified to ISO 27001. So obviously that would be against the new standard. And the reason for this is that certification bodies will cease to certify against the old 2013 standard beyond 2025. So they won't be allowed to issue certificates to the 2013 standard. So that's why it's really important to address this matter now and not leave it any later. So what's changed then in relation to the new standard? So for those that didn't attend the last webinar, I definitely recommend going back because I do cover this in a lot more detail. But for those of you that did and have got a bit of an idea on the changes, this is just a high-level recap, really, of the changes. So at a very high level, the changes include 56 controls being merged into 24 newly titled controls, which you might think, well, hey, happy days. But actually, there have been 11 that have been added in that are completely new controls. Okay, so all of the controls within Annex A have now been placed into 4 themed sections instead of the old 14 control groups from the old standard, which I think is a massive improvement. And it's really helped to simplify the controls into just 4 key areas, which are organisational, people, physical, and technological. So the 24 changes and clarifications to clauses include older existing clauses, which have now been tidied up and just a lot more transparent, really. I think they're a bit more user-friendly and easier to understand, document and implement, which I think has got to be a good thing. I think also, we have to remember that when standards are updated roughly every 8 years or so, that the standards are moving with the times, and it's really great to see enhanced controls on things like cloud security, which I'll touch on shortly. Because let's face it, most of our systems that we use within business are cloud-based. So it's great to see that the changes that have been made are really helping to keep us abreast of today's risks and threats, and also the types of technology that we're using currently. So in terms of the new controls then, let's take a look at the organisational controls. This is an area where we've got the majority of the controls in place, where we've seen some additional requirements. The first one being threat intelligence. So threat intelligence, quite simply, is to provide awareness of the organisation's threat environment so that the appropriate mitigation actions can be taken. So this can come from many different sources, such as the NCSC or local police websites. There's also additional tools that you can add to detect possible phishing attacks. We know that a lot of organisations are now having training on phishing attacks and to try and prevent it by having some tests done in relation to this on an ongoing basis. So this also includes considerations into external threats, because we have to remember that information security is much more than just protecting data. It's also including the physical security. As I mentioned earlier about cloud services, there is an enhancement here. So the actual requirement is to specify and manage information security for the use of cloud services. So I think you'll agree, more and more businesses rely on cloud-based computing. I know, for example, at Blackmores, our sales CRM, our finance system, pretty much everything is cloud-based now. So it is important to verify the security of your service provider to ensure it's adequate. And you need to basically check to see if they've got all the valid information security related credentials, such as Cyber Essentials, SOC, or CSA Star. You could adopt the principles of ISO 27017, and this is the standard for cloud security. So that's ISO 27017, if you want to make a note of that. That's a really useful document that dovetails beautifully into Control A 5.23. The other standard that you might want to check out is ISO 27018, and that's a protection of personal information in the cloud, in the public cloud. And finally, last but not least, I'm going to throw another one at you, is ISO 27701, and that is all about personal data. Okay, so that's the standard that ties very much in alignment with the GDPR requirements that are applicable in Europe, for example. So yes, that's all about personally identifiable information, and that's ISO 27701. The next one is ICT readiness for business continuity. So we know that there are already controls in Annex A for business continuity, but these are specifically related to ICT and other associated assets during disruption. And again, there are a few standards that could assist with this. The common one that you may already be familiar with is the business continuity, business continuity standard, ISO 22301. But you may not have heard of ISO 27031, which is the ICT readiness for business continuity. And again, it may be that you don't necessarily want to get certified to that standard, but it's definitely a good read in order to be able to establish best practice and have that benchmark that you can set yourself in terms of continual improvement, which, as we know, that's what the ISO standards are all about. So I think the key thing here really is to ensure that, by incorporating the controls in Annex A with your business continuity management systems and making it an integral part of your business operations helps to enhance resilience for your organisation and the impact on your key stakeholders. So just make sure it's not a bolt-on, that it is an integral part of your risk management planning and business operations. So let's move on to physical controls. We've just got one here actually. And again, I'll go into more detail on this in the previous webinar. But the control here is to detect and deter unauthorised physical access. So typically this would include CCTV, access control, swipe cards, that sort of thing. And this also includes the ability to, on a regular basis, monitor these access methods, and also looking at, how effective are they at picking up any anomalies. So as an organisation, you may be paying for services like a facilities management company to manage the CCTV for you, for your organisation, and access control. But how effective is it? So this control helps to put that to the test for you. So moving on to technological controls. So the first one here is configuration management. And this requires you to ensure that hardware, software, services and network functions correctly with required security settings, and configuration is not altered by unauthorized or incorrect changes. So that basically means configuration for things like firewalls, software and hardware devices, passwords, etc. So just making sure that they're clearly documented, explained and monitored on a regular basis. So this helps you to ensure that nothing has been changed without notifying the relevant people. Because as we know, within IT, it's constantly changing, which is fine, but we need to ensure that the relevant people are notified of those changes, because that's a risk in itself if they're not. Now, there is another standard, ISO 20000, which is the IT service management standard, that will help to understand configuration if you'd like further guidance on that. Information deletion. Interestingly, obviously, this goes hand in hand with the personal identifiable information, GDPR controls. So the new control here is to prevent unnecessary exposure of any sensitive information and to comply with legal, statutory, regulatory and contractual requirements for information deletion. Okay, so you might have specific contracts with key stakeholders that you have to remove their data after a certain period of time of working with them, for example. And again, it's about understanding what you should and shouldn't be deleting within your organisation. I mean, this did already exist within the standard, but it's simply been clarified further. So now you need to prove that data has been deleted as required. And if you use a third party for this, they will need to provide the relevant certificates as well. So again, it's about providing that audit trail. So with data masking, I mean, ultimately this is, how you limit the exposure of sensitive data, including PII, to comply with any legal, statutory and regulatory and contractual requirements. So again, there's a lot of crossover here with things like GDPR, for example. And there are 3 options for data masking, which again, I went through in the previous webinar, which I won't go into detail on now. Data leakage prevention, and this is to detect and prevent the unauthorized disclosure and extraction of information by individuals or systems. So you just need to ensure that you've got a secure email system in place, as well as VPNs and regular security training to secure all your from any potential leaks across the business. So they're both technological, and obviously if there's a human involved with it, that's another risk as well. Monitoring activities. So this control is to detect any potential security incidents, and that you need to have appropriate monitoring in place to detect any malicious or dangerous behaviour. Web filtering. So this helps to protect your systems from being compromised by malware and to prevent access to unauthorised web resources. But it could also include social media sites. Just be mindful that there are lots of different ways to be able to get access to your systems, and that's one mechanism. And then last but not least, secure coding. So this is to ensure software is written securely thereby reducing the number of potential information security vulnerabilities in the software. So if you've created your own secure coding, just be sure to evaluate it against industry professional standards such as OWASP and NIST. So that's a high-level overview of the changes. As I said, go back to the previous webinar if you haven't watched it already to get a bit more detail on the changes. But the key purpose now is really to take you through the steps to transition. So I'm going to be walking you through the key steps, and there are ultimately 5 of them here. The first one is exposing the gaps between the 2013 and the 2022 version of the standard. The second is to update the ISMS documentation. So that's including documenting the changes and implementing those changes. The third one is to raise awareness of the changes. So there isn't much point in making these changes if employees aren't aware of them. And then that leads on to the next stage, which is that audit trail, which is all about gathering evidence and the mechanisms that you can use in order to be able to demonstrate your evidence of compliance. And then last but not least, it's the preparation before the transition audit. So that's the dotting the I's and crossing the T's to ensure that everything is in place before that transition audit. So let's go. Let's kick off with exposing the gaps between the 2013 and 2022 version of the standard. Before you move into implementation, you need to ensure that you have planned back from your transition date. You've got a good understanding of the controls and you've completed a gap analysis to see where the gaps are in your current system. So by conducting a gap analysis against 27001-2022, you'll be able to highlight the new vulnerabilities which can be addressed, and that then can help you to move into the implementation stage. But you may actually be pleasantly surprised that you're already doing a lot of the new controls. They are already part of your day-to-day, working controls within your business. And we have found that in many cases. So it's not as daunting as you might expect. You may already have a lot of the controls in place. It may just be that you haven't got those controls formalised yet, and that's what the gap analysis will help to highlight. And it may be that some of the controls that you already had previously for your old ISMS are still useful. They're still helping you to reduce risk and add value to your business. So why not keep them? It's not going to do you any harm. You don't need to worry about keeping those controls in place in your statement of applicability as well. You might just need to assign a customized control number now if that's changed. I guess this is a good point to just highlight the transition game plan that we've got in place. So the workbook that we've got acts as a guide to conduct your gap analysis. So it'll take you through step by step what you need to do. But you could do it yourself if you buy a copy of the new standard. It's just a bit more of a manual process, that's all, figuring out what the changes are. So once you've completed the gap analysis and you know where the weaknesses are and what you need to do, this is time to address them and to implement the required changes. So I thought it would be helpful to highlight what documentation needs to be updated. Well, the first one is the statement of applicability. Based on the new controls and the merged controls, your statement of applicability will have to be quite different to address the new changes. There are also different changes around managing risk. So your risk assessment will need to be updated as a result of the new controls from the statement of applicability. And you'll also need to review and update your objectives and action plans as a result of the changes. Now, we did mention that monitoring and measurement is much more focus with the new standard. So it's very likely that you'll need to enhance your monitoring measurement procedures that you've currently got in place. And then finally, the internal audit schedule and program. So your old version isn't going to be compliant for the new standard. So when it comes to your transition audit, the assessor will expect to see that you've gathered evidence through internal audits of compliance against the new standard. Okay, so yeah, I think that overall, updating other documents. I think there is another one that I haven't included on the slide there, but it's actually the management review that also needs to be updated. One of the things that you could do, which is useful, is an Annex A control mapping. So it maps from the old to the new. And again, these are examples of templates that we've got in the IsologyHub that may be helpful for you. So once you've documented the changes, you've got internal approval for those changes. It's now time to raise awareness and communicate the changes within the organisation. Because if you're not doing this, number one, you're not going to gain the benefits of the improvements that you'll be making within your organisation, which would be a crying shame, not to capitalise on the time and effort that you've made in terms of making those changes. But, secondly, it can help to improve morale if employees know that their business is, totally on point when it comes to information security controls, raising your game, raising your standards. So it helps, to demonstrate confidence internally and also externally when you manage the transition to key stakeholders. Thirdly, it's obviously you need to be able to demonstrate to your certification body that you have made employees aware of the changes. And so they're typically within the training records, for example. And again, that's where we've got training courses as part of the game plan. So it's not just about updating your documentation. So you'll obviously need to communicate these changes to the wider business. Once the updated information security management system has been uploaded to its home, wherever that is, that could be on SharePoint, on a Teams channel, on your server, whatever that is, the main thing is that everybody's got access to it. So it's important to have a solid plan to ensure that it is communicated effectively. So in terms of some launch considerations then, so again, we've got more guidance on this in the IsologyHub game plan for 27001 transition. But the launch is all about building awareness and engagement with the updated management system, because ultimately you want to gain momentum from the get-go. You want to be able to get all those key stakeholders involved so you get off to the best possible start. So one important factor before you start planning your launch activities is the initial approach. And basically there are two options. There is the soft launch or the all-in launch. So a soft launch will involve launching the ISMS with a limited audience initially before sharing it with the whole organisation, whereas an all-in launch will be to the whole organisation all at once. So that's something for you to consider. Okay, so you might want to have a soft launch with a team of your InfoSec champions or a particular function or department, or depending on timeframes, you might not have the luxury of doing that and getting feedback from them. You might just have to go all in and communicate it to the wider business. That's entirely up to you. The second thing is to set clear launch goals. So it's good to have some specific and realistic goals to aim for when it comes to launch targets. people generally don't like to have change imposed on them without explaining, a good justified, solid reason behind the reasoning for that change. So try and set the tone in a positive way. Explain the bigger picture, why these changes are fundamentally business critical for the organisation, because at the end of the day, it's about protecting your assets, it's about protecting your reputation and your brand, and also obviously any personal data that you hold on your employees or indeed on client data as well. So setting that tone really can make a difference when it comes to engagement. So I think obviously a lot of organisations will be just looking at this as a tick box from a compliance perspective, but try and look at it from the point of view of where is the company going to gain benefits. So when it comes to winning new business and submitting tenders, the fact that you've got the latest information security controls is going to help you to win new business. The fact that you've got 27,001 2022 is going to help you from a sales and marketing perspective. So try and focus on the positives rather than the negatives if you can do. Okay, and I think the important thing to remember here is it needs to be specific to your business when you're setting these launch goals. So, consider when you're going to launch the new management system, who are you going to communicate it to, and how long will the launch last? So there are lots of different things that you can do in terms of time management and how it's rolled out. It could be part of an information security awareness week, for example, within your business. Another consideration is to take a phased approach. Again, if you've got that luxury of time, let's say a 12-month period, where obviously this webinar has been published at the end of May 2023, you could have a 12-month phased approach if your next surveillance visit is in May next year. Okay, so in terms of a phased approach, again, you could break it down into different stages, and so this can help to ease the burden of any changes. And yeah, basically, if you've got a larger organisation and you want to make those changes over a long period of time, that could be easier. And also, it might help with engagement. So in terms of the different methods of raising awareness of the changes, it shouldn't just be an email that you send out, ideally. You can get a bit more creative, which will help to encourage engagement. So things could be, having your own internal event. That you might want to publicise that though on social media. It could be part of a national or global event, which it could be like a cyber security week, for example. You could have a challenge. You could have a fishing challenge. Not the one where you're catching a mackerel, but the ones involved with trying to hack into your systems. That could be an interesting challenge that you could do. And you could have a video series. So again, you could have a bit of a drip feed of awareness around certain things that you've identified as risks to your business. You might want to have your very own webinar series as well that you do. And again, that could be used for future inductions for new employees. And the last but not least is potentially creating an email series. So again, a drip feed of information rather than just one email. Okay, so now that you've effectively communicated the changes, the next stage then is to gather that evidence of compliance. So in terms of gathering the evidence of compliance, there are a couple of different ways of doing this. One is through internal audits. So this is obviously the most effective route. This isn't going to be new to you if you're already certified to 27001 or any other ISO standard. You'll have an audit program in place. Obviously, you need to update that, but you should be auditing the new controls. So you need to bear in mind the timeline for conducting your internal audits to the new standards. So again, working back from your transition audit date. So in terms of management review, again, once you've completed the documentation changes, implementation, awareness, internal audits, the last stage is management review. So this is where you need to give the leadership team the heads up on what the changes are. And also you need to take into consideration some of the new controls in management review. For example, needs and expectations of interested parties that are obviously relevant to information security, and also to reflect on the outcome of the internal audits, in particular for the new controls. And depending on the frequency of your management review and how this aligns with your transition project timelines, you can either complete a full management review using the updated agenda, or an interim management review to cover interested parties, internal audit results, and the planned transition visits. All I'd say here, though, is just to ensure that you allow plenty of time to build up that evidence of compliance ahead of the transition visit. So ideally, from the awareness training through to the audits, you need to allow a couple of months, and then obviously have your management review after that. So in terms of a time frame, you could be looking at up to 6 months depending on the size of your organisation and the information security management system. You could do it in a much shorter time frame, within a couple of months. It all really depends on your resources as well. So finally, what do you need to do to prepare ahead of your transition visit? Well, first of all, just check that you've got your formal transition assessment arranged, that it is in place. So the date's been booked and you've communicated that effectively to the rest of the company, and that you have been given a transition plan from your certification body, and you've completed any documentation that they have sent you. So some certification bodies will send you a readiness review document. So just to make sure that you've confirmed the visit and you've completed any documentation relating to the transition that they would like you to complete before the actual visit. So there are a couple of things here, really. I mean, the first thing is to revisit that initial gap analysis to make sure that you have actually closed out all of the actions and addressed all of the weaknesses. In terms of the document check, you need to review the information security documents to ensure that the key documents in relation to the updates are fully completed, the version number is updated and that's correct, and that they're available to relevant staff. Okay, so this is a case of reviewing where the standards say shall, for example, and wherever there is a document requirement. And I went through the documented requirements earlier on. For example, the updated statement of applicability was one example of that. And then when it comes to the evidence check, this is where you need to review the InfoSec system for all the key evidence and records to demonstrate that the changes have been fully implemented. Now, if you've completed internal audits effectively, in theory, you should have samples of evidence already embedded within your internal audit report. So this is just a final check to see that all those changes have been fully implemented, and to ensure that the key records are being retained, that any action is taken appropriately, and to make sure that, all the, for example, training records are in place to demonstrate that employees have been made aware of the changes. Okay, so that's it in summary. So hopefully that's given you an overview of the new changes to the standard, what you need to do now, which is to obviously book your transition visit in if you haven't done so already. And also I've outlined the key steps as well that are involved in managing the transition to ISO 27001 2022. Hopefully you've taken away some useful pieces of information and learning and tips to manage your transition journey, and I wish you the very best of luck with it. My contact details are on the screen here if you'd like to reach out if you've got any queries at all. But I've also got a little bit of time left, I believe, around about 10 minutes for any questions. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask me on ISO 27001 transition. Looks like I've had a question through, which is asking about what are the main challenges involved with transitioning to ISO 27001. I would probably say I think some businesses look at these new controls and not necessarily look at what they've already got in place. First of all, I think it's worthwhile to identify what you've already got in place, and you might already be in a better position. I think the main challenges really is just on the statement of applicability. Obviously, for most organisations, that will be a very well established document, and you might be reluctant to make changes to it. But I think if you look at it from a point of view of making it a major enhancement to your information security as a business, once you've actually made those changes, it may seem a bit of a challenge initially, but once you've done it, it'll be worth it. And it's just then a case of updating it every year. Does the 2022 version of the standard address AI? Based on our experience of the standard over the last year or so, since we've been implementing the standard both from scratch and also for transition, we haven't seen any requirements specifically addressing AI within the standard. But there is a standard for that, and which we've actually done a webinar on, which was ISO 42001. So if you're interested in that, that's something that you can check out. Any other questions for me today? Okay, it doesn't look as though we've got any other questions there. I think one of the questions that we get asked quite frequently is how long will it take? And it really does depend on your availability, when you can get started, and also, yeah, how many sites you've got, how big is the information security management system in terms of the controls that you've got in place. So we've been advising about 6 months, but obviously if you've got your transition coming up next month, then you might be thinking, oh, crikey, what do I do? I think, well, obviously you could try and make it happen within a month if you were tight on time. If you were committed 100% to it and you didn't have anything else to do, maybe. And also if you've got information security champions to help you as well. So I think, you know, if you've got people within the business that have got responsibilities in relation to 27001, so that could be, you know, business continuity, response team, head of HR when it comes to personnel security, physical security. So, you know, physical security for the building, for the locations, and also commercial. So, you know, when it comes to contractual requirements as well in relation to information security. So yeah, I think if you can get other people involved, it could significantly help you and to help to fast track it. But again, if you are in that situation, the IsologyHub transition game plan has all the templates that you need and training courses as well. I think one of the things that we've also found is that a number of certification bodies will have a few forms that you have to complete. It could be called a readiness review, and that's to check where you're at as far as the transition is concerned. So if you haven't already received that, then that's something that you can ask for in advance, along with the agenda for the next visit. Oh, I've got a question that's come up. Will I have to go through stage 1 and 2 again if I miss the deadline? Yes, based on our experience of other ISO standards, once the deadline's passed, that's it. And it can be quite expensive and painful to go through that process from scratch again. So obviously, if you're combining your transition with an existing surveillance, it's going to be minimal cost. Whereas if you're a larger organisation, you could be paying several days for stage 1 and several days for the stage 2. And there's a lot more work involved with that. So yeah, to answer your question, you would have to go through stage 1 and stage 2 again if you miss the deadline. And that's based on the rules that are enforced on the certification bodies by the likes of UCAS, for example, or ANAB, and that also comes from the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. And you know, organisations have got a long time to actually manage the transition. So, you know, the standard came out in October 2022, and that gave organisations 3 years to manage the change. So, in my opinion, there shouldn't be any excuses really not to have done that within 3 years. We were encouraging our clients to do it within the first year, ideally, so that they were completing their transition in 2023, which was, you know, last year. Obviously, I think, you know, if the standard's been updated and there are improvements in there, you know, why would you wait? Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me today. Again, I hope you found it informative and useful, and it will help you on your journey to transition to ISO 27001 2022. And if you have any questions, then please feel free to reach out to your contact at PJR or myself, and we'd be more than happy to help. Thank you very much for listening today.